They had been told the Americans were monsters. That capture meant torture, starvation, humiliation, or worse. But on a frozen December morning in 1944, when 23 German women prisoners stepped through the gates of an American POW camp in eastern France, they encountered something they had never expected: tables set with gleaming forks and knives, warm bread, steaming coffee, and eyes that held no hatred. One woman whispered to her companion, "Is this a trap?" The American guard simply smiled. That day marked the beginning of a transformation that would challenge everything they believed about enemies, war, and humanity itself. Helga Becker sat in the back of the canvas-covered truck, her fingers numb despite being pressed into her armpits. Around her, 22 other women huddled in similar positions, their breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the frigid air. The truck lurched over frozen ruts in the road, each jolt sending fresh waves of pain through bodies already exhausted from 3 days of walking. At 22, Helga had spent the last year as a communications clerk for the Wehrmacht, stationed at a forward communications post near the Rhine. She had typed orders, filed reports, and listened to radio transmissions crackling through the static. She had never fired a weapon, never seen combat up close. Yet here she was, captured when the American advance had swept through their position faster than anyone had anticipated. Next to her, Elizabeth Krauss, a nurse who had served at a field hospital, kept her eyes closed. At 35, she was one of the oldest among them. Her face bore the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much suffering. Across from them, young Anna Schmidt, barely 19 and a radio operator, clutched her thin coat tighter, her lips moving in what might have been prayer. The words of their commanding officer echoed in Helga's mind, spoken just weeks before the collapse. "If the Americans capture you, prepare yourself for the worst. They show no mercy to German women. Remember what happened at..." The officer had trailed off, leaving imagination to fill the terrible blanks. The propaganda posters she had seen flashed through her memory. Crude caricatures of Allied soldiers as brutal savages, headlines screaming about atrocities. "What do you think they will do with us?" Anna's voice was barely audible over the rumble of the engine. Elizabeth opened her eyes. "Whatever happens, we face it with dignity." Her voice carried the steadiness of someone who had held dying men's hands and told them everything would be all right, even when it wouldn't be. Helga said nothing. Her mind was trapped in a loop of fear and uncertainty. She thought of her parents in Munich, her younger brother who had joined the army at 17 and whose letters had stopped coming months ago. Would they ever know what happened to her? The truck hit another bump, and someone behind her let out a small cry of pain. Through a gap in the canvas, Helga caught glimpses of the landscape. Bare trees against gray sky, fields covered in frost, the occasional ruined building. This was occupied territory now, but it felt like another world entirely. The truck slowed, then stopped. The sound of American voices came from outside, incomprehensible words in sharp, unfamiliar rhythms. The canvas was pulled back, revealing a military policeman with an armband and a clipboard. Behind him stood a compound surrounded by wire fencing, but not the crude, threatening structures Helga had imagined. The buildings looked solid, recently constructed. Smoke rose from chimneys. The guard gestured for them to climb down, his expression neither cruel nor kind, simply professional. "Line up here," an officer said in accented but clear German. "You will be processed and assigned quarters. Follow instructions, and there will be no problems." As they formed a ragged line, Helga noticed details that contradicted her expectations. The guards were watchful, but not menacing. One of them was actually talking quietly to another prisoner group nearby, not shouting or threatening. The gate they passed through had a sign in German and English: "Prisoner of War Camp 7, American Command." The processing building was warm. That was the first shock. Helga had expected to be left in the cold, perhaps as a form of punishment or intimidation. Instead, there were stoves burning in corners, radiating heat that made her frozen fingers tingle painfully as blood returned to them. The second shock came when a female American officer approached their group, Captain Sarah Morrison was perhaps 40, with auburn hair pulled back in a neat bun and a medical insignia on her uniform. She spoke to them in German, her accent carrying hints of a life that had known their language long before this war. "I am the medical officer for this facility," she said. "Each of you will receive a basic health examination. If anyone needs immediate medical attention, please identify yourself now." She paused, looking at them with something that looked disturbingly like concern. "I know you are cold and frightened, but you are safe here." That is not propaganda. That is simply the truth. No one spoke. The women exchanged glances, uncertain. Elizabeth finally raised her hand slightly. "Two of our group have injuries from the march. Nothing serious, but they should be examined." Captain Morrison nodded and made notes on her clipboard. Then she did something that made several women gasp. She removed her own olive drab jacket and draped it over the shoulders of young Anna, who was visibly shaking. "You look like my daughter," Morrison said quietly. "She is 19 as well, working in a factory in Ohio, building aircraft." She walked away before Anna could respond, leaving the young woman staring at the jacket in disbelief. The processing continued in an orderly fashion. Names were recorded, personal belongings inventoried and stored in labeled boxes. They were photographed and given prisoner identification numbers, but through it all, there was no brutality, no degradation. One woman asked if she could keep a small locket with her mother's picture. The clerk hesitated, consulted a superior, then allowed it with a notation in the records. "This doesn't make sense," Anna whispered to Helga as they waited their turn for medical examination. "They should hate us. We are the enemy." Helga had no answer. Her own confusion was deepening with every moment. The medical examination was thorough but respectful. Captain Morrison checked each woman for injuries, malnutrition, and signs of disease. She asked questions about their health history, noted everything carefully, and provided basic first aid where needed. When she discovered Elizabeth's nursing background, the two women fell into a professional conversation about wound care that seemed to transcend the circumstances entirely. As the afternoon wore on, they were led to their quarters, a long wooden barracks with rows of bunks, each with a mattress, pillow, and 2 blankets. Windows let in light. A stove at each end provided heat. It was Spartan but clean, and infinitely better than the frozen fields they had slept in during their capture. "Choose your bunks and settle in," their escort said. "Dinner is at 1800 hours. The bell will ring." After he left, the women looked at each other in silence. Then, slowly, they began to move, claiming beds, folding their thin coats as makeshift pillows. Someone began to cry quietly, whether from relief or continued fear, Helga could not tell. Perhaps both. The bell rang precisely at 6. Helga had been lying on her bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling, trying to make sense of the day. Around her, the other women stirred, uncertain what to do. Elizabeth stood first. "We should go," they said. "Dinner." Better to comply than to give them reasons for anger. They filed out into the gathering dusk, following the path that had been pointed out earlier. The dining hall was another wooden structure, larger than their barracks, with steam rising from vents in the roof. Inside, long tables were arranged in rows. Other prisoner groups were already seated, men separated from women, all in the same worn military uniforms they had been captured in. A guard directed them to an empty table. As they sat down on the benches, Helga noticed metal bowls stacked at one end. She assumed they would be given thin soup, perhaps some bread if they were lucky. Instead, what appeared made her breath catch in her throat. American soldiers were bringing out trays of food, and beside each bowl placement were utensils, not wooden spoons or crude implements, but actual silverware. Forks, knives, and spoons made of metal, gleaming under the overhead lights. "They are giving us weapons," Anna breathed, her eyes wide. "This must be a trap. They are testing us to see if we will attack them, and then they will have excuse to." "No." Elizabeth's voice was firm but shaken. "Look at the other tables. Everyone has them. All the prisoners." It was true. At every table throughout the hall, prisoners held forks and knives, using them to eat their meals. The guards watched, but casually, without the tension that would accompany an expected attack. Helga's mind struggled to process this. Giving prisoners metal utensils sharp enough to be dangerous was insane unless the Americans simply did not see them as dangerous, or perhaps did not see them as animals who needed to be deprived of basic dignity. The food arrived, thick stew with chunks of meat and vegetables, fresh bread still warm, margarine, and coffee that actually smelled like coffee rather than the ersatz substitutes they had been drinking for years. Some of the women began to cry. Helga felt her own eyes burning. "I cannot," one woman said, her voice breaking. "This is some cruel joke. They will take it away. They will laugh at us for believing." A young American private approached their table. He looked barely old enough to shave, with freckles across his nose and nervous energy in his movements. He spoke in broken German. "Please, eat. Is food. Is good food. For you." He gestured encouragingly, then added in English, as if remembering a phrase he had rehearsed. "You are hungry. Please eat." Elizabeth picked up her fork first. Her hand trembled slightly as she speared a piece of meat, brought it to her mouth, and chewed, her eyes closed. "It is real," she said quietly. "It is food, real food." She looked at the others. "Eat. Whatever this is, however long it lasts, we need our strength." Slowly, hesitantly, the others began to eat. Helga picked up her own fork, testing its weight. It was solid, functional, ordinary. She took a bite of the stew and felt the warmth spread through her body. The meat was tender, the vegetables cooked properly. The bread had texture and substance. It was the best meal she had eaten in months, perhaps years, and she was eating it with a real fork, in a heated building, as a prisoner of war. Around the hall, conversation gradually resumed. Not cheerful, certainly, but human. People spoke in low voices, comparing the food to what they remembered from home, to the rations they had survived on during the final months of fighting. The young private who had spoken to them earlier was now helping an elderly male prisoner navigate the serving line, his gestures patient and kind. "I do not understand this," Helga said, setting down her fork. "We were told the Americans were barbarians, that they would treat us worse than animals, but this..." She gestured at the table, at the food, at the utensils. "This is civilized. This is human." An older woman sitting nearby leaned forward. She had been processed with an earlier group. "You will find many things here do not match what we were told. The question is, what else have we been lied to about?" The silence that followed that question was heavy with implications none of them were quite ready to explore. The days that followed established a routine that continued to upend Helga's expectations. Each morning began with a roll call in the compound yard, followed by breakfast in the dining hall. Then came work assignments. The Americans, it turned out, needed help with various tasks around the camp, and they were willing to employ prisoner labor within the bounds of international convention. Helga, with her administrative experience, was assigned to the camp records office. She found herself working alongside Private James Miller, a lanky 24-year-old from Pennsylvania whose grandparents had emigrated from Bavaria. His German was imperfect but enthusiastic, often mixing English words into sentences when he could not remember the German equivalent. "My grandmother still makes sauerbraten," he told her one morning as they sorted through personnel files. "She taught me some German when I was little, but I have forgotten most of it. Is strange, yes? I have German blood, but I wear American uniform, and you are my prisoner." He said it without malice, simply stating a peculiar fact. Helga looked at him carefully. He had a kind face, open and earnest. "Does your grandmother know you are here? That you are guarding German prisoners?" "Yes. She writes to me. She says she prays for me and for all of you. She says the war is a terrible thing, that it makes enemies of people who should be friends." He paused, considering his words. "I think maybe she is right. You do not seem like monster to me. You seem like a person, like someone's daughter, maybe someone's sister." "I am both those things," Helga said quietly. "My parents are in Munich. My brother is somewhere on the Eastern Front, I think. I have not heard from him in 4 months. Miller nodded slowly. My older brother is with the infantry. He was in Normandy on D-Day. He was wounded at St. Lo. We got telegrams saying he would recover, but he trailed off. I worry about him. They worked in silence for a while after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Something had shifted. Helga began to see Miller not as her captor but as another young person caught in circumstances neither of them had created. At lunch that day, Anna excitedly told them about her assignment in the communications room, where she was helping to sort and log radio traffic. They let me touch the equipment, she said, wonder in her voice. They showed me how their systems work. They trust me not to sabotage anything. Can you believe that? They trust us. Elizabeth, working in the medical dispensary, had similar stories. Captain Morrison asks my opinion on patient care. She discusses cases with me as if I were a colleague, not a prisoner. Today, an American soldier came in with a severe laceration, and she had me assist with the suturing. She said my hands were steadier than hers. But not everyone was adapting well to these new realities. Marguerite Fisher, a stern woman in her 40s who had been a party official before being pressed into military service, spoke loudly in the barracks that evening. You are all fools, she said, her voice cutting through the quiet conversations. This is psychological warfare. They are trying to make us weak, make us forget who we are and who they are. They give us good food and warm beds and kind words, and you lap it up like starving dogs. Have you forgotten what we are fighting for? Have you forgotten the fatherland? Helga felt anger rise in her chest, surprising her with its intensity. And what exactly are we fighting for, Marguerite? What did all those propaganda posters promise us? Victory? Security? A better future? Look where that has brought us. Look where it has brought Germany. You speak like a traitor, Marguerite spat. I speak like someone who has eyes to see, Helga shot back. These Americans, these barbarians we were warned about. They treat us better than our own officers often did. They feed us well. They do not beat us. They do not. She stopped, unable to continue. Elizabeth stood up, positioning herself between the two women. Enough. Fighting among ourselves serves no purpose. We are here. This is our reality. Each of us must decide how to face it. But we do not have to tear each other apart in the process. The tension remained, but the argument ended. That night, lying in her bunk, Helga thought about what Marguerite had said. Was she being weak? Was she betraying something by acknowledging the humanity of her captors? Or was she simply being honest about what she saw and experienced? The questions kept her awake long into the night. The incident happened 3 weeks into their imprisonment. A group of male prisoners, influenced by hardline former SS officers in their ranks, staged a protest in the dining hall. They refused to eat, demanded better treatment, and made accusations of violations of the Geneva Convention. It was political theater, Helga realized, not based on any actual mistreatment but on ideology and the refusal to accept their circumstances. The situation escalated when one of the ringleaders threw his bowl at a guard. Within seconds, the hall erupted into chaos. Tables overturned, men surged forward, and for a moment it seemed violence would consume everything. Helga and the other women had been eating at their usual table. They froze as military police rushed into the hall. The women expected gunfire, expected the brutal suppression they had been trained to anticipate. Instead, they witnessed something different. The American commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, walked calmly into the center of the disturbance. He was unarmed, his hands visible and empty. He called out in clear, commanding German, "Stop, everyone stop." The authority in his voice cut through the chaos. The military police did not draw weapons. They simply formed a line, creating a barrier between the protesters and the rest of the prisoners. But they did not attack. Hayes addressed the ringleaders directly. "You wish to speak about violations? Then we will speak. But not like this. Not with violence and disorder. You will select representatives. I will meet with them tomorrow morning. You will present your grievances formally, and I will respond formally. That is how civilized people handle disagreements. That is what the conventions require. Do you accept these terms? The former SS officer who seemed to be leading the protest looked confused, as if he had expected and perhaps wanted a violent response. And if we refuse, he demanded, then you will be confined to your barracks, and your meals will be brought to you until you are ready to behave rationally. You will not be beaten, you will not be starved, but neither will you be permitted to endanger others or disrupt the order of this camp. The choice is yours. The SS officer's bluster deflated. He had been robbed of his martyrdom. Without violence to justify his ideology, he had nothing but empty rhetoric. He nodded reluctantly, and the protest dissolved. As the prisoners filed out of the dining hall, Helga found herself walking near Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. He noticed her staring at him. "Something on your mind, Miss Becker?" He knew her name. Of course he did. He probably knew all their names. "I expected you to use force, sir. They attacked your men. One man threw one bowl." Hayes corrected gently. "Hardly an attack. And yes, I could have ordered my men to restore order with batons and rifle butts. It would have been quick. But what would it have accomplished? More anger, more hatred, more confirmation of every piece of propaganda you were all fed about American brutality?" He shook his head. "No, you are people, not animals. You are soldiers who fought for your country, just as I fight for mine. The war is decided. You lost. But that does not make you monsters, and I will not treat you as such." He walked away before Helga could respond, leaving her standing in the cold evening air with tears freezing on her cheeks. That night, she remembered something her father had told her when she was a child. The measure of a man's character is not how he treats those who can help him, but how he treats those who cannot. The Americans, she realized, were demonstrating character she had rarely seen even from her own commanders. December brought heavy snow and the approach of Christmas. The war continued elsewhere, but in the camp, there was an odd suspension of normal time. Helga had settled into her work routine with Private Miller, and they had developed an easy working relationship punctuated by conversations about everything and nothing. One afternoon, as they organized supply requisitions, Miller asked her about German Christmas traditions. She described Weihnachten as she remembered it from childhood. The tree with real candles, the smell of baking Lebkuchen, her mother's voice singing Stille Nacht on Christmas Eve. "My grandmother sings that song," Miller said, "but in English. Silent Night. I did not know it was German originally. It is from Austria, I think. But yes, it is ours." She paused. "Or perhaps it belongs to everyone now. Music does not respect borders the way armies do." On Christmas Eve, something unexpected happened. The Americans organized a special dinner for all prisoners, with extra rations and even some decorations in the dining hall. Someone had found pine branches and fashioned them into wreaths. Candles flickered on each table, their light soft and warm. After the meal, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes stood and addressed the assembled prisoners. "Tonight, in camps across this continent, men and women on both sides are away from their homes and families. Some are in far worse conditions than you find here. Some are fighting. Some are dying. War has separated us, placed us on opposite sides of a conflict we did not start and could not stop. But tonight, for a few hours, we remember what connects us instead of what divides us." He nodded to someone near the door. Private Miller entered, carrying a harmonica. He looked nervous, but he lifted the instrument to his lips and began to play. The melody was unmistakable. Stille Nacht. Helga felt something break inside her chest. Around her, other prisoners began to sing, quietly at first, then stronger. Both verses, in German, the words flowing naturally from memory and longing. Some of the American guards joined in, singing in English, the two languages interweaving like the melody itself. When the song ended, there was silence. Then someone else began another carol, and another after that. The evening passed in this strange, transcendent way. Enemies singing together, guards and prisoners, Americans and Germans, all of them simply people far from home on a holy night. Later, as they walked back to their barracks through the snow, Anna spoke for all of them. "How can we go back to hating them after tonight? Elizabeth answered quietly. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps that is what they are trying to teach us. That hatred is not inevitable. That even enemies can recognize each other's humanity, if they choose to. Even Marguerite, who had been so hostile to their weakness, was silent. She had sung too. They had all seen the tears on her face during Stille Nacht. January turned to February, and rumors began to circulate through the camp. The war was entering its final phase. The Russians were advancing from the east. The Americans and British were preparing to cross the Rhine. Germany was collapsing, and everyone knew it except perhaps the most fanatical, who refused to acknowledge reality. In early March, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes called a general assembly. His face was grave as he addressed them. I have news. Berlin is under heavy bombardment. The fighting in the west is nearly over. The end is approaching. He paused. For you, this means decisions must be made. Soon, you will be repatriated. You will return to Germany. But I must warn you, the Germany you return to will not be the Germany you left. The prisoners stood in silence, absorbing this information. Return home. It was what they had dreamed of since capture. But Hayes was right. What home were they returning to? Cities reduced to rubble? A government that had led them into this disaster? Families that might not have survived? That evening, the women gathered in their barracks, and for the first time, they openly discussed what had been unspoken for months. Not the war, but what came after. I am afraid, Anna admitted. My parents lived in Hamburg. I have heard what the bombing did there. What if there is nothing left? We will rebuild, Elizabeth said, but her voice lacked conviction. We must. What else can we do? Helga thought about Munich, about her parents' home near the Englischer Garten. Was it still standing? Were they still alive? She had received no letters, no news. The silence was worse than any confirmed bad news could have been. I want to stay here, one woman said suddenly. The words hung in the air like a confession. I know that sounds crazy. We are prisoners. But I feel safer here than I think I will feel when I return. The Americans, they treat us like human beings. Will our own people do the same? After everything that has happened, no one condemned her for saying it. They were all thinking similar thoughts, wrestling with the same contradictions. They had been taught to hate these Americans, to fear them, to see them as the enemy. Instead, they had found unexpected kindness, unexpected humanity. What did that say about everything else they had been taught? The next morning, Private Miller found Helga in the records office. He seemed hesitant, holding something small wrapped in cloth. I wanted to give you this, he said, for when you go home. Something to remember that not everything about this time was terrible. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a silver spoon. Standard military issue, but polished to a shine. It is not much, he said, but maybe when you use it, you will remember that people on different sides can still recognize each other's humanity. That enemies do not have to be monsters. Helga took the spoon, her throat tight. I will not forget, she managed to say. I will not forget any of this. How you treated us. How you treated me. When others tell me the Americans were brutal, I will know better. I will always know better. The day came in mid-April. Trucks arrived to transport them to a processing center where they would begin the journey back to Germany. The women packed the few possessions they had accumulated. Some letters they had been allowed to write and receive, small tokens from the Americans they had worked with, and memories that would prove harder to carry than any physical object. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes personally oversaw their departure. He shook hands with each woman as she boarded the truck, speaking briefly to several. When he reached Helga, he looked at her steadily. What will you tell people about this place, Miss Becker? The truth, she replied, though I am not sure they will believe me. They may not. Hayes agreed. The truth is often harder to accept than comfortable lies, but tell it anyway. Someone will listen. Someone will remember, and perhaps, in remembering, they will learn something about what we could have been if we had chosen differently from the start. The journey back was long and difficult. They traveled through a landscape of destruction. bombed cities, displaced people, and an atmosphere of defeat and uncertainty. The Germany they found was not the powerful nation they had left, but a broken country struggling to survive. Helga was fortunate. Her parents' house in Munich had survived, damaged but standing. Her mother cried when she opened the door and saw her daughter. Her father, thinner and older than she remembered, embraced her without words. That night, eating thin soup at the battered kitchen table, they asked her about her imprisonment. She told them everything, about the warm barracks, the proper food, the forks and knives, Private Miller's harmonica playing Still Knocked, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes's discipline without brutality. Her parents listened in silence. When she finished, her father spoke slowly. "We were told many things that turned out to be lies. Perhaps this should not surprise us. But it is still hard to accept how thoroughly we were deceived." Her mother touched the silver spoon that Helga had placed on the table, running her finger along its smooth surface. "Keep this safe," she said. "One day, when things are better, when people are ready to hear such stories, you will need proof that it really happened, that humanity survived even in a war." But Helga discovered her mother was right about one thing. Most people were not ready to hear her story. When she told acquaintances and neighbors about her treatment in the American camp, they reacted with skepticism or dismissal. Some accused her of making up propaganda for the Americans. Others simply could not reconcile her account with everything they had believed. "You were brainwashed," one former party member told her. "They treated you well to make you compliant, to make you forget who you are." Helga did not argue. She had learned that some people preferred their comfortable hatreds to uncomfortable truths, but she kept telling her story to anyone who would listen, and slowly, she found others who had similar experiences. Elizabeth, who had settled in Frankfurt, wrote to her regularly. Anna had returned to her family in what was now the Soviet zone, and her letters spoke of very different treatment by the Russian occupiers. Decades passed. Germany rebuilt, transformed, reconciled with its past in ways that were painful but necessary. Helga married, had children, built a life in the new Federal Republic, but she never forgot those months in the American POW camp. The silver spoon remained in a place of honor in her kitchen, polished regularly, and she told its story to her children and, eventually, to her grandchildren. In the 1,980 seconds, as part of a historical documentation project, she was interviewed about her wartime experiences. The interviewer was young, too young to remember the war firsthand, and listened with rapt attention as Helga recounted her capture, her imprisonment, and the unexpected humanity she encountered. "What do you want people to learn from your story?" the interviewer asked. Helga thought for a long moment, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, the silver spoon resting on the table between them. "I want them to understand that humanity can survive even in the darkest circumstances, but only if people choose it. The Americans who ran that camp made a choice every day to treat us with dignity despite everything we represented to them. That was not weakness. That was strength of a kind that military power cannot measure." She picked up the spoon, feeling its familiar weight. "I also want them to know that when we dehumanize our enemies, we lose more than we gain. We were taught that the Americans were monsters. When we discovered they were not, it forced us to question everything else we had been told. Truth has a way of cascading like that. One crack in the wall of lies, and eventually the whole structure comes down." The interviewer leaned forward. "Do you think such treatment of prisoners would be possible today? Or was it unique to that time and place?" "It is always possible," Helga said firmly. "But it requires people to choose it. Every day, in every situation, there is a choice between cruelty and kindness, between hatred and understanding. The Americans we encountered made their choice. They treated us the way they would want to be treated if positions were reversed. That is not complicated. It is simply difficult. But difficult is not the same as impossible." Years later, after Helga had passed away, her daughter donated the silver spoon to a museum dedicated to the history of World War II. It sits now in a small display case with a placard that tells its story. Visitors pause to read about Helga Becker and the 22 other women who discovered that their enemies had given them not just food to eat, but their dignity back. The spoon is ordinary in every way except one. It carries the weight of a truth that remains relevant across generations, that in the middle of the darkest war, in the midst of the most terrible hatred, there were still people who chose to see the humanity in others. That, even when everything argued for brutality and revenge, some chose kindness instead. And that choice, simple and profound, made all the difference.